In the year 1984, a shroud of mist enveloped the ancient, gnarled trees of Black Hollow Woods, where 7 souls, bound by friendship yet varied in spirit, ventured into the heart of darkness. Michael, the bold leader whose confidence bordered on recklessness. Sarah, his companion, whose eyes darted with a mix of curiosity and dread. Jacob, the jester whose laughter masked a deeper unease. Dana, the cynic, who clung to logic as a shield against the unknown. Thomas, the stoic, whose strength was his silence. Emily, the dreamer who saw the world through a painter's eyes. And Stephen, the novice, whose heart raced with the thrill of the unknown, yet trembled at the forest's whispers. Their packs, laden with the tools of their era, walkie-talkies, torches, and cassette players, marked them as intruders in this timeless realm. As they delved deeper, the canopy above wove a tapestry of shadow, dimming the day to twilight. The forest's silence was profound, save for the occasional whisper of leaves or the distant, mournful cry of a solitary bird, as if the woods themselves were mourning their intrusion. They sought adventure, a test of their mettle against the wild, yet as they pressed on, the air grew thick with an unspoken dread. Whispers, faint as the breath of ghosts, began to weave through the trees, and lights, fleeting as fireflies, danced at the edge of vision, only to vanish upon pursuit. Michael, with a dismissive wave, urged them forward, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. Nightfall found them in a glade, where they kindled a fire that seemed to flicker with reluctance against the encroaching darkness. The silence was oppressive, a silence that seemed to listen, to wait. And then, from the depths of the woods, came a melody, a haunting whistle, both beautiful and chilling, that seemed to weave through the trees, circling them like a spectral predator. "What manner of sound is this?" Stephen's voice trembled, his earlier bravado now a distant memory. The whistle grew, not in volume but in presence, as if it were the voice of the forest itself, ancient and sorrowful. Sarah clung to Michael, her grip a silent plea for reassurance, while Jacob's attempt at humor fell flat, his voice betraying his fear. The whistle ceased abruptly, leaving a void that seemed to suck the very warmth from the fire. From the shadows, a form emerged, indistinct, a silhouette against the night, watching them with eyes unseen. "Who goes there?" Michael's challenge was met with silence, the figure motionless, an enigma wrapped in the darkness. They were not alone in this wood, and whatever shared this night with them was not bound by the laws of man or nature. The forest had begun to claim them, not with force, but with a subtle, insidious dread that promised a night of terror from which escape might be but a fleeting dream. The night had only just begun, and already the forest was drawing them into a nightmare from which there might be no escape. The fire's glow waned, as if cowed by the very presence of the figure that lingered at the edge of the clearing. A heavy stillness filled the air, pressing upon the group with an invisible weight. The only sound was the faint crackle of the dwindling flames, and the subtle rustling of leaves that seemed to whisper secrets of the ancient forest, secrets meant only for the ears of the damned. Michael, usually the first to act, found his voice had deserted him. His bravado faltered under the gaze of the silhouette, which seemed less a person and more a shadow given life. Sarah's breath hitched, her fingers digging into his arm as if grounding herself against the encroaching terror. Each member of the group was gripped by a different shade of fear. Dana's logical mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Thomas stood like a statue, every muscle taut. Emily's wide eyes reflected the dwindling firelight, capturing the scene like a twisted painting. And Stephen's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out any coherent thought. Jacob, who had always faced fear with a jest, now felt the weight of the moment smothering his usual humor. He opened his mouth, perhaps to laugh or to shout, but the sound that emerged was little more than a choked breath. The figure did not advance, nor did it retreat. It simply existed, a fixed point of dread in a world that suddenly felt all too fluid. "What are you?" Michael finally forced out, though his voice was a mere whisper, swallowed by the vastness of the woods. The figure responded with silence, its form indistinct, shifting slightly as if it were made of the very mist that surrounded them. A shiver ran through the group as the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees, the cold seeping into their bones despite the fire's warmth. The trees around them stood like sentinels, ancient and indifferent, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. Emily, ever the artist, saw in their gnarled forms a tableau of despair, as if the forest itself was a living nightmare, waiting to ensnare them in its depths. The whistle began again, softer this time, almost tender, as though coaxing them to follow. It came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the clearing with its eerie melody. Stephen, his heart thrumming like a trapped bird, felt an inexplicable urge to step towards the sound. It beckoned him with a promise that was both sweet and sinister, as if the very air was calling him home. He took a step forward, his body moving of its own accord, when a firm hand gripped his shoulder, yanking him back to reality. "Don't," Thomas said, his voice gruff, his eyes narrowing at the figure. "We stick together." The spell broke, and Stephen blinked, realizing how close he had come to crossing the invisible line between safety and the unknown. The figure seemed to sense the change, and without a sound, it began to dissolve, melting into the darkness from which it had emerged, leaving nothing but the lingering whistle and the cold that now pervaded the glade. "Pack up," Michael ordered, his voice regaining some of its former strength. "We're moving." "Where to?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. There was no direction that promised safety, but staying here in the place where the figure had appeared seemed unthinkable. "Anywhere but here," Michael replied, his tone brooking no argument. With hurried, trembling hands, they doused the fire, leaving the glade in darkness. The walkie-talkies crackled with static as they tried to reach each other in the blackness, but even technology seemed to falter in the face of the forest's malevolence. The group huddled close, flashlights flickering as they scanned the surrounding woods, seeking a path that might lead them out of this cursed place. Yet the forest had shifted around them. The familiar trail they had followed was gone, swallowed by the night, and in its place a new path unfurled, a narrow, winding trail that seemed to stretch deeper into the woods, its end obscured by the ever-present mist. It was as if the forest itself was guiding them, offering a route that was both a promise and a threat. With no other choice, they stepped onto the path, the whistle now a distant echo that followed them like a memory, too faint to pinpoint, yet too persistent to ignore. The trees closed in around them, and as they ventured further into the heart of Black Hollow Woods, each step seemed to carry them deeper into a world where the laws of man no longer held sway, where something ancient and malevolent waited just out of sight, waiting for them to stray too far. In the darkness, unseen eyes watched, and the night pressed ever closer. The forest had claimed them, and the true terror had only just begun. The path before them seemed to twist and writhe like a serpent, its form obscured by the creeping mist that clung to the forest floor like a shroud. Each step the group took was labored, as if the earth itself sought to ensnare their feet, dragging them into its cold, unyielding embrace. The night air was thick with a damp chill, and every breath drew in the scent of decay, of ancient wood and loam disturbed by something long buried, something that should never have been awakened. Emily's flashlight flickered erratically, casting shadows that danced grotesquely, shapes that twisted into forms not of this world, hinting at the presence of something lurking just beyond the veil of sight. She bit her lip, stifling a scream, her grip on the flashlight so tight her knuckles turned white, as if the light were her only lifeline in this abyss. "Stay close," Michael whispered, his voice a mere breath, as if the very sound could summon the unseen horrors that lurked in the surrounding gloom. He kept his pace steady, though his mind raced with the chilling realization that they were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. The forest had morphed into a labyrinth, its paths shifting, leading them deeper into its malevolent heart. Jacob, whose laughter had always been a shield against fear, now walked in silence, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. haunted by the feeling of being watched. The playful jaunt into the wilderness had morphed into a nightmare, and he sensed with a certainty that chilled his bones that they were not alone. Dana, whose logical mind had always dismissed the supernatural, now felt the world tilt beneath her. The mist seemed to take on a life of its own, swirling into shapes that vanished the moment she focused on them, as if mocking her rational explanations. Her hand found Stephen's, clinging to it, seeking any semblance of normalcy in this distorted reality. They moved in silence, the oppressive quiet broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustling of leaves in a wind that did not touch them, only whispered through the trees in a soundless, eerie dance. The haunting whistle had ceased, but its memory echoed, a sinister lullaby in their minds. Without warning, the path split, presenting two equally ominous trails, both shrouded in mist, neither offering a hint of safety or escape. The group halted, gripped by indecision as they stared into the twin abysses. "Which way?" Sarah's voice trembled, fear seeping through each word. Michael hesitated, his gaze flickering between the paths, both stretching into darkness. His instinct screamed to choose, to keep moving, but a deeper primal fear held him back, as if the forest itself was testing them, and the wrong choice could be their undoing. Thomas, the tracker, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the ground for signs, for any indication of the right path. But here the signs were scrambled, as if the forest had conspired to mislead them. "There's no way to know," he murmured, his voice hollow. "We're being led." "Led where?" Jacob's voice cracked, the fear he'd suppressed now breaking free. Emily felt a pull towards the left path, a whisper in her mind, not comforting but compelling, as if the forest was calling her by name, drawing her into its darkest secrets. "We have to choose," Dana said, her voice shaky, her usual certainty shattered. As they stood at this crossroads, the trees seemed to lean in, the mist thickening as if the forest was impatient, urging them towards their fate. Somewhere in the shadows, the figure watched, its presence a dark stain on reality. "Left," Michael decided, his tone firm despite the doubt that gnawed at his resolve. "We go left." With a collective breath, they turned onto the left path, the darkness enveloping them. Behind, the other path vanished into the mist as if it had never existed. They walked on, the weight of their choice pressing down, unaware that the horrors awaiting them were far worse than any they had imagined. For the forest was not just a place, it was an entity, ancient and wrathful, tightening its grip on the 7 souls who dared to tread upon its hallowed ground, leading them not to escape, but to the heart of its darkest secrets. As the group ventured down the left path, the darkness seemed to grow denser, swallowing the feeble beams of their flashlights, leaving them with only a sliver of visibility. The mist curled around their ankles, a cold, clammy presence that tugged them deeper into the forest's heart, each step a battle against the uneven, treacherous earth that seemed intent on ensnaring them. The trees, gnarled and ancient, arched overhead, their branches intertwining to form a grotesque canopy that blotted out the sky. The air chilled further, carrying the stench of something rotten, something ancient that had slumbered for eons, now roused by their intrusion. A dread, more primal and suffocating than before, enveloped them, seeping into their very marrow, draining any warmth they had left. Emily, drawn by an inexplicable force, led the way with faltering steps, her heart a drum in her chest. The whispers that had once called her name now retreated into the background, but their echo remained, a chilling reminder that something in this forest knew her, awaited her. She could feel its gaze, patient, biding its time to claim what it deemed its own. "Keep moving," Michael urged, his voice a strained whisper, the command lacking its usual force. He too felt the growing malevolence, the unseen eyes that followed their every move. The path seemed to stretch infinitely, each step pulling them further from the known world, deeper into a realm where reality itself was malleable. Without warning, the path plunged into a ravine, where the trees grew even more twisted, their roots sprawling across the ground like the limbs of some ancient, malevolent beast. The air here was thick with decay, mingled with a metallic tang that hinted at blood. A collective shiver ran through them as they realized the implication. "Do you hear that?" Stephen's whisper was barely audible over his own heartbeat. They halted, listening. At first, silence reigned, broken only by their ragged breaths. Then, a faint sound emerged, not of a gentle stream, but of something heavier, more ominous, a slow, deliberate drip echoing through the ravine, growing louder, closer. "We need to turn back." Dana's voice rose in panic. "This isn't right. We shouldn't have come." "There's no going back," Michael replied, his eyes betraying his fear. "We must go on." Pressing forward, the sound intensified, and with it, a new terror. The ravine's walls closed in, forcing them into a single file. The mist thickened, reducing visibility to mere feet. Through the haze, they discerned the source of the dripping, a dark, stagnant pool nestled between the roots of a colossal ancient tree. This tree was a monolith of darkness, its branches stretching like skeletal fingers, its bark charred and cracked as if by some ancient fire. The water beneath was thick, oily, reflecting no light, with faint ripples suggesting something had just stirred its depths. An overwhelming dread filled the air, almost tangible in its intensity. The group stood petrified, staring at the pool as a low, mournful sound rose from it. A sound not quite a whistle, but something more profound, carrying centuries of sorrow and despair. Then, as if summoned by an unseen force, the water began to bubble and churn. From its murky depths, a shape emerged, initially indistinct but slowly taking form. A figure, draped in shadow, rising from the pool like a specter from a grave. The forest had guided them here, to this place of decay and darkness, to confront the ancient horror that now stood before them. As the figure stepped from the water, its form becoming clearer, the group realized with mounting horror that the night had only just begun to reveal its true face. The figure was not human. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnatural, and its face, though obscured by shadow, seemed to hold eyes that burned with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. It stood before them, water dripping from its form, each drop echoing like a tolling bell. "Welcome," it hissed, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "To the heart of Black Hollow Woods." The group, rooted to the spot by fear, watched as the figure extended a hand towards Emily, its fingers unnaturally long and thin. "You have been called," it said, its gaze fixed on her. "You will join us." Emily felt a cold grip on her heart, her legs moving of their own accord towards the figure. Michael lunged forward, grabbing her arm, pulling her back. "No!" he shouted, his voice breaking the spell. The figure's eyes narrowed and the air grew colder. "You cannot leave," it whispered, its voice now a chorus of whispers, as if the forest itself spoke through it. "This is where your journey ends." With a gesture from the figure, the trees around them seemed to animate, branches reaching out like arms, roots shifting beneath their feet, trapping them. The group struggled, but the forest held them fast, the figure's laughter a cacophony of echoes around them. As the figure stepped closer, the shadows around it deepened, and the night seemed to close in, the forest's ancient malice now fully unleashed. They were not just in the woods. They were part of it, ensnared by its will, their fate sealed by the very earth beneath their feet. In the heart of Black Hollow Woods, under the gaze of the ancient malevolent entity, they realized there was no escape. The forest had claimed them, and as the figure reached out once more, the true horror of their situation enveloped them, a darkness from which there was no awakening. The figure from the pool stood motionless, enshrouded in a darkness that seemed to bend reality around it, making its form both indistinct and undeniably present. The group, gripped by an icy fear, watched as it slowly raised its head, revealing eyes that were not eyes at all, but hollow voids that seemed to look through them, piercing into their very essence. Emily, who had felt an inexplicable pull toward this path, gasped, her breath hitching in her throat. Those eyes, she had seen them before, not in waking life, but in dreams that had shadowed her since childhood. Dreams she now understood were not mere figments, but premonitions. The figure was not just a stranger, it was an extension of her, a darkness that had lain dormant within her psyche, now manifesting in the physical world. The realization struck her like a physical blow, and with it came a voice, soft yet pervasive, speaking in a tongue she had never heard yet somehow comprehended. You were always meant to come here, Emily. You belong to the forest as it belongs to you. No, she whispered, retreating a step, but the pull was now magnetic, irresistible. The others, witnessing the change in her, saw her face drain of color, her eyes reflecting a terror mixed with an eerie recognition. Emily, what's happening? Sarah's voice was tinged with hysteria, but Emily was beyond response, her attention wholly on the figure that approached with deliberate echoing steps, each one a knell of doom. Michael, sensing the imminent horror, reached for Emily, intending to yank her away from the figure. But as his fingers touched her, a searing pain shot through him, forcing him back, his eyes wide with shock. Emily's gaze met his, now serene, yet unsettling. It's me, Emily murmured, her voice distant, as if echoing from another realm. It's always been me. The others, realizing the gravity of their situation too late, tried to intervene, to break whatever spell held Emily, but the forest itself seemed to animate. Roots and vines erupted from the ground, ensnaring their legs, binding them in a vice-like grip. Their struggles only tightened the forest's hold, until breathing became a labor. The figure, now fully emerged, towered over Emily, its form a silhouette of shadow. With a slow, deliberate motion, it extended what could only be described as a hand towards her. The air between them shimmered with an energy both beautiful and terrifying. Emily, don't! Stephen's cry was swallowed by the thickening mist, his plea lost in the void. But Emily did not resist. She reached out, her hand trembling as it met the figure's, and in that moment, the world seemed to fracture. The ground quaked, and a deep, resonant sound, a mix of a roar and a wail, erupted from the forest as if the earth itself mourned. The figure began to dissolve, its darkness wrapping around Emily, pulling her into its embrace. She closed her eyes, and for a heartbeat, there was silence, a profound stillness as if time paused. Then, with a final, shuddering breath, Emily opened her eyes again. But they were not her eyes. They were empty, filled with the same hollow darkness that had consumed the figure. She turned to face the group, a faint, sinister smile playing on her lips. The roots and vines that had held them began to tighten, dragging them towards the pool, towards the darkness. One by one, they were pulled into the murky depths, their screams silenced by the water until only silence remained. As the last of them vanished, the pool stilled, its surface smooth, reflecting nothing but the gnarled branches above. Emily stood alone, her form flickering like a dying ember, before she too faded into the mist, leaving behind an eerie silence. The forest, ancient and wrathful, had reclaimed what was its own. As dawn's first light filtered through, the mist receded, revealing the glade, silent, empty, and utterly devoid of life. The forest was whole again, its secrets buried deep, waiting for the next unwitting souls to tread upon its sacred ground.
My. I'm sure if I could feel fear, I would be very scared. Until next time.